Picture a wall so wide that 2 chariots could race along its top, wheel to wheel, and never touch. Picture a wall so tall that men standing atop it look down on the clouds of dust kicked up by armies below. This is not exaggeration for effect. This is what ancient travelers swore they saw with their own eyes. For over 2,000 years, the walls of Babylon have haunted the imagination of every civilization that came after them. Greek historians called them one of the 7 wonders of the world. Persian kings marched their armies toward them and hesitated. Roman engineers studied their ruins centuries later and shook their heads in disbelief. But here's the strange part. Ask most people what they actually know about these walls, and the answer runs out fast. Big, blue, old, gone. That's usually where the knowledge stops. Nobody talks about the tens of thousands of workers who spent their entire lives shaping wet mud into brick after brick after brick. Nobody talks about the river barges hauling bitumen upstream, or the kiln fires that never went out, or the engineers who had to solve a problem no one on Earth had solved at that scale before. How do you protect a city so rich, so exposed, and so hated by its neighbors, that its enemies dreamed of burning it to the ground? To understand why Babylon built the way it did, you first have to understand where it stood. Babylon sat in the flat, fertile heart of Mesopotamia, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This land gave the city everything a civilization could want: rich soil, abundant water, and a position at the crossroads of every major trade route between Persia, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Arabian deserts. That same location made Babylon a target the moment it became wealthy. Caravans loaded with tin, timber, textiles, and precious stones passed through its gates on their way to distant markets. Merchants grew rich. Temples filled with gold. And every neighboring power, Assyrians to the north, Elamites to the east, nomadic raiders drifting in from the desert fringe, watched Babylon's wealth grow with open envy. For centuries, this wealth came at a price. Babylon was sacked. It was burned. Its temples were looted. Its people marched off in chains more than once. The Assyrians, in particular, treated the city as both a prize to be seized and a threat to be crushed, destroying it so thoroughly at one point that its own conquerors feared they had angered the gods. A city that keeps getting destroyed learns one lesson above all others: wealth without protection is just an invitation. So when Babylon finally broke free of Assyrian domination and rose as the capital of a new empire, its rulers understood something that would shape everything that followed. If Babylon was going to be the richest city on Earth, it also had to become the most difficult city on Earth to destroy. That problem, how to defend limitless wealth sitting in the open flatlands of Mesopotamia, is the problem the walls of Babylon were built to solve. The man who would turn that problem into stone and mud brick was Nebuchadnezzar II, king of a newly resurgent Babylonian Empire. He inherited a capital still scarred from generations of invasion, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his reign: Babylon would never be vulnerable again. This wasn't the ambition of a builder chasing spectacle for its own sake. It was strategy. Nebuchadnezzar understood that a capital city is only as strong as the walls around it, and he set out to design not a single barrier, but a layered defensive system unlike anything the region had seen. Royal surveyors walked the perimeter of the city long before a single brick was laid, measuring distances, studying the flow of the Euphrates as it cut directly through the urban center, and mapping where gates needed to stand to control trade without exposing the city to attack. Architects debated the placement of not one wall, but multiple concentric rings, an outer defensive line further out in the plain, and closer, immense inner walls hugging the city proper. Between these barriers, engineers planned wide moats, fed by canals diverted from the river itself, turning the approach to Babylon into a maze of water and mud that no army could cross quickly. Every gate had to be positioned with military logic. Roads leading into the city were aligned so that any invading force would be forced to march parallel to the walls before reaching an entrance, exposing their flank to defenders the entire time. This was urban planning as a weapon. The city itself, its walls, its moats, its gates, its very streets, was designed as a single interlocking system built to make Babylon nearly impossible to approach, let alone conquer. None of this vision meant anything without material, and Mesopotamia posed a unique challenge. This was a land with almost no natural stone, no quarries, no cliffs of granite waiting to be cut. What Mesopotamia had instead was mud, endless, fertile river mud, deposited year after year by the flooding Tigris and Euphrates. So Babylon's engineers did something remarkable. They turned mud into an empire's fortress. Workers dug clay from pits near the riverbanks, mixed it with water and straw, and packed it into wooden molds to form sun-dried mud bricks, the basic building block of the entire wall system. These bricks were cheap, abundant, and could be produced by the millions, but sun-dried mud alone wouldn't survive centuries of weather and siege. For the sections that mattered most, the outer faces of the walls, the towers, the gates, Babylon's builders fired their bricks in kilns, baking the clay until it hardened into a much stronger, weather-resistant material. Kiln firing required enormous amounts of fuel and constant supervision, so entire industries sprang up purely to keep those fires burning day and night. To bind these baked bricks together and seal them against moisture, workers turned to bitumen, a natural tar seeping up from the ground in nearby deposits. Thick, sticky, and waterproof, bitumen was used almost like ancient mortar, layered between courses of brick to lock them into a single solid mass and to keep the destructive Mesopotamian floodwaters from eating away at the foundations. Reeds, harvested from the marshes, were woven into mats and laid between certain brick layers to reinforce the structure and help distribute weight. Timber, far rarer in this land of mud, was imported from mountainous regions to the north, floated down the rivers on barges alongside precious stone reserved for the most symbolic structures. Every one of these materials had to reach the construction site in staggering quantities, and that meant Babylon's engineers had to build a supply chain before they could build a wall. Barges moved bitumen and timber down the Euphrates. Wagons hauled clay from nearby pits. Brickyards operated in a constant grinding rhythm, each brick often stamped with the name of the ruling king, a mark of quality control and royal pride pressed into the clay before it ever left the mold. And for the wall's most famous feature, the gleaming blue glazed bricks later used to face the great Ishtar Gate. Craftsmen developed a specialized glazing technique, firing bricks coated with mineral compounds that turned a rich, unmistakable blue when heated, then arranging them into towering images of dragons and bulls that announced the power of Babylon to anyone who approached. Behind every one of those bricks stood a human being, and building Babylon's walls demanded human effort on a scale almost impossible to imagine. Royal engineers and architects sat at the top of this system, translating the king's vision into working plans, calculating wall thickness, foundation depth, and drainage angles that had to hold under the weight of massive fortifications built on soft river silt. Beneath them, master craftsmen supervised the trickiest work. The glazed brick artisans of the Ishtar Gate, the bitumen specialists, who understood exactly how thick a layer needed to be to seal a joint, the surveyors who kept construction lines straight across a project spanning miles. And beneath all of them labored the true backbone of the project, tens of thousands of workers, many of them conscripted through labor obligations, some of them prisoners of war and captives brought back from Babylon's own military campaigns. These were the people who dug clay from the pits, hauled it in baskets on their backs, fed the endless kilns, and stacked bricks by hand under the brutal Mesopotamian sun. Boatmen ferried barges of bitumen and stone. Ox drivers and donkey handlers moved wagon loads of brick and supply from riverbank to worksite. Administrators tracked rations, work quotas, and material deliveries on clay tablets, running what amounted to one of the largest logistics operations of the ancient world. Feeding this workforce alone was its own enormous undertaking. Granaries had to be stocked. Bread had to be baked in bulk. Beer, the everyday drink of Mesopotamian laborers, had to be brewed by the barrel to keep thousands of workers fed and functioning day after day, year after year. This was not a quick project. It was decades of sustained labor, organized with a level of administrative discipline that rivaled the engineering itself. Now picture the ground itself, long before any wall rises from it. Surveyors stake out the wall's path across the flat Mesopotamian plain, running lines for miles in either direction. Before a single brick can be laid, workers must solve the region's oldest enemy, water. The Euphrates floods unpredictably, and any foundation sunk into untreated silt will eventually sink, crack, or wash away. So construction begins below ground. Trenches are dug down to more stable soil, and layers of compacted clay and reed matting are packed into the foundation to spread the immense weight of the walls above and to channel water away from the base. Drainage channels are cut alongside the foundation line, directing runoff into nearby canals instead of letting it pool and undermine the brickwork. Only once this foundation is judged solid does the real climb begin. Course by course, sun-dried mud brick rises from the trench, forming the massive inner core of the wall, thick, dense, and cheap to produce in the volumes required. As the wall gains height, kiln-fired brick takes over on the outer face, each layer sealed with a thick coat of bitumen that binds brick to brick and creates a moisture barrier the mud alone could never provide. The wall doesn't rise as a single flat barrier. Babylon's engineers build it as a system, an inner wall of tremendous thickness, paired with an outer wall separated by a corridor wide enough for defenders and equipment to move along. All of it further protected by wide moats fed from diverted river water. At intervals along the wall's length, towers rise higher than the parapet itself, space to give archers overlapping fields of fire along every approach. Walkways run along the top, wide enough, according to ancient accounts, for chariots to pass, giving defenders rapid mobility to reinforce any threatened section without descending to ground level. Battlements crown the wall's edge, their crenellations cut to give archers cover while still allowing them to fire down on attackers below. Narrow arrow slits pierce the tower walls, letting defenders strike without exposing themselves. And then come the gates, the most vulnerable points in any fortification, and therefore the most heavily reinforced. Chief among them, the Ishtar Gate, a monumental entrance faced in glazed blue brick, its surface alive with rows of sculpted bulls and dragons, flanked by soaring towers that dwarf anyone standing beneath them. This is not decoration for decoration's sake. A gate this imposing tells every visitor, every merchant, every potential enemy the same message before a single word is spoken. Babylon is not a city you casually attack. Every stage of this process, from foundation to final glazed brick, moves under constant inspection. Brick stamps bearing the king's name serve as a quality mark, a way of tracing faulty batches back to their source. Engineers walk the lines checking for cracks, for uneven courses, for weak bitumen seals, because a fortification this expensive cannot afford to fail at the moment it's tested. Once complete, this wasn't simply a wall. It was a machine designed to grind down any army foolish enough to approach it. Its sheer thickness meant that battering rams and siege engines effective against ordinary fortifications simply could not punch through. Its height put attackers under constant fire long before they reached the base. And because the defense was layered, outer wall, moat, inner wall, any force that broke through the first barrier found itself trapped in a killing ground, exposed to arrows and projectiles from both sides while still separated from the city itself. Towers projecting outward from the wall line let defenders fire not just straight ahead, but diagonally across the wall face, catching attackers in overlapping arcs of fire wherever they tried to mass. Gatehouses were built as choke points on purpose, funneling any assault into a narrow, heavily watched corridor rather than allowing an army to spread out and attack broadly. Beyond the physical defenses, the walls carried a psychological weapon just as powerful as any arrow. A structure this massive, this clearly beyond the capability of ordinary kingdoms to replicate, was a message in itself. Enemies who camped outside Babylon's walls didn't just see a barrier. They saw evidence of a civilization with resources, manpower, and were far beyond their own, and that alone was enough to make more than one potential invader think twice. Every fortress eventually meets the test it was built for, and Babylon's walls faced that test when the armies of Cyrus the Great, king of the rising Persian Empire, marched on the city. As historical accounts, Babylon did not fall because its walls were breached in battle. Ancient sources describe Cyrus's forces diverting the flow of the Euphrates, lowering the water level enough for soldiers to advance along the riverbed itself, entering the city not through broken fortifications but through the very waterway that ran beneath them, a route the walls, for all their engineering brilliance, were never designed to seal. Some ancient accounts, most famously from later Greek writers, describe the city's population continuing to feast and celebrate even as Persian troops moved through the streets, unaware that the outer defenses had already been circumvented. Modern historians treat these dramatic details with caution. They were written generations after the events by authors working from second-hand tradition. But the core outcome is well supported. Babylon's downfall came from a strategic vulnerability in its water systems, not a structural failure of the walls themselves. In other words, the greatest fortification system in the ancient world wasn't defeated by force. It was outmaneuvered. Over the centuries, the legend of Babylon's walls grew even larger than the walls themselves, and it's worth separating what we can verify from what may have been exaggerated. Ancient Greek writers describe dimensions so extreme, walls dozens of meters thick, towering to heights that dwarf modern buildings, that many historians today treat these figures with healthy skepticism. Archaeological excavation of Babylon's foundations confirms walls of genuinely enormous scale, among the thickest defensive structures known from the ancient world, but likely not quite as extreme as the most dramatic classical accounts suggest. The claim that chariots could race along the top of the walls, side by side, is repeated in ancient sources and fits with the archaeological evidence of a genuinely wide wall walk, though we can't confirm it was ever actually used this way in practice, rather than simply being wide enough in theory. What archaeology does confirm with confidence: the layered wall system, the use of kiln-fired and glazed brick, the presence of moats and multiple defensive rings, and the sheer scale of the Ishtar Gate, portions of which survive today and have been reconstructed in museum collections, giving us physical proof of the craftsmanship ancient writers tried to describe in words. Some details remain uncertain. Exact heights are debated. The precise sequence of construction phases across Nebuchadnezzar's long reign is still being pieced together by archaeologists. But the broad picture, an ambitious, layered, technically sophisticated fortification system, unlike anything else built in its era, is solidly supported by the physical remains still being studied today. Long after Babylon itself faded from a ruling capital into a monument of the past, the lessons embedded in its walls didn't disappear. Persian engineers, having conquered the city, absorbed elements of Mesopotamian fortification design into their own building traditions. Centuries later, when Roman military engineers studied fortifications across the ancient world, the layered defense concept Babylon pioneered, multiple walls, moats, controlled gate access, echoed forward into fortress designs built across the Roman frontier. Even in the modern era, archaeologists excavating Babylon's ruins have used the site to understand ancient engineering principles that still inform how we think about materials science, hydraulic engineering, and urban defense planning today. What makes the walls of Babylon extraordinary isn't just their size. It's the fact that an entire civilization, working with little more than river mud, reeds, and natural tar, engineered a defensive system so advanced that it took a diverted river, not an army, to finally get past it. Empires rise and fall, kings are forgotten. But somewhere beneath the modern Iraqi desert, the bones of those walls still lie in the earth, mute, patient evidence of what human ambition can build when a civilization refuses to be destroyed again. Everyone knows the walls of Babylon. Now you know how they were really built.